Hello and welcome to a special two-part edition of The Note in which we're going to be discussing this book, Money, Blood and Revolution. It's a very ambitious attempt to fix the entire science of economics. Yes, the author does think that there is a problem with economics that needs fixing. He's here with me now to discuss it. He's George Cooper. George, thanks very much for joining me today. Now, your basic theory is that economics is a science in crisis, as diagnosed by a guy called Thomas Kuhn. Take me through what a scientific crisis is.
Well, Kuhn came up with a very interesting analysis of the process of scientific development. And what he identified was that you can get into a state of what he called a scientific crisis when you get lots of competing schools of thought, which all have valid elements within them, but all contradict each other. And he said when you get into that problem, the science effectively gets stuck.
Right. Now, let's go through some examples. Copernicus would be one of our first most famous figures. Where was astronomy before Copernicus came up with the idea that, that the Earth went around the sun?
Well, of course, before Copernicus, we all believed that the Earth was stationary at the very centre of the universe, with the stars and the sun orbiting around it. And that led astronomers to making extremely complicated mathematical models to try to explain the motions of the planets. And they could never quite explain them properly. And their models kept getting more and more complicated with epicycles and difference and things like that. And then along came Copernicus, and he made the paradigm shift that said, let's let the sun be at the centre of the solar system, let the Earth move, and then suddenly all of the models became much, much simpler. So that's the paradigm shift.
Okay, we have another example, which is the science of anatomy. Tell me what anatomy was like as a science before William Harvey came along.
Well, before Harvey's discovery of circulatory blood flow, the theory was an ancient Greek theory, which was that our bodies were controlled by the balance of the humus. There's 4 different fluids in the body that had to be in balance. And blood particularly was believed to flow in the same direction through the arteries and through the veins. Harvey came along and he worked out that actually blood flows out from the heart through the arteries and then flows back to the heart through the veins. And that allowed him to come up with his circulatory motion, which suddenly made the whole system much simpler.
Okay, but also obviously radically different. Now, another very famous example of a breakthrough would be Charles Darwin and his theory of evolution. But now let's take a look at your schematic picture of where the economics profession is now, where economics is as a science. Now, this is a fascinating model where you're looking at the different schools of economics on 2 different scales. Explain to me where all these different economists lie on this, in the spectrum.
Okay, well, of course, traditionally when we look at the different schools of economic thought, we're told to think about them in terms of the left versus right-wing perspective. So you think of Adam Smith being on the right-wing side, and you think of Karl Marx being on the left-wing side. Now, what I've tried to do with this diagram is show that that's not actually good enough to explain all of the different schools.
Right.
So what I've done is I've put 2 axes. I've said on one axis we've got the belief in the stability of markets, and then on the vertical axis how much government the school thinks should be in the economy.
So that leads to the interesting conclusion that monetarists, who we generally think of as right-wing post-Thatcher and Geoffrey Howe, are in fact somewhere in the middle when it comes to a belief in the stability of markets. And because they believe in active central banking, they're also somewhere in the middle when it comes to the degree of involvement in of the government.
Yes, well, you see, this is a very interesting, I think, logical inconsistency within the science of economics, because the science of economics talks about a self-stabilizing economic system. That's part of the efficient market theory. That's what the neoclassical school believes in. But then, of course, we've actually got the central banks trying to stabilize the system with their monetary policies. So the fact that we've got the central banks doing monetarist policy is an admission that the neoclassical school is wrong.
Even though most people think they believe in neoclassical thought. Meanwhile, one final point which is fascinating, the Austrian school economists, who we tend to think of as very right-wing these days, are at one with the Marxists, or obviously as left-wing as it gets, when it comes to a belief in the stability of markets. People on both of those apparent ideological extremes don't believe that markets are stable on your account.
That's correct, and this is partly why I drew this diagram in this way, because there is actually a similarity between the Austrian, the Marxist, and for that matter the Keynesian schools, in that they all have mechanisms within their theory that explain why markets are fundamentally unstable. Slightly different mechanisms, but nonetheless they agree on that key point that markets are not self-stabilizing.
Okay, George, thank you very much indeed. I think George has convinced us that economics is in some kind of a crisis, that we're continuing to go along with a hypothesis even though none of us now really believe that it's true. In the second part, we're going to move on to the rather more difficult subject of how we are actually going to fix economics.